Chapter 1. Before Sussex was Sussex. Long before Sussex had a name, before the Romans, the Saxons, or even the Celts walked its soil, this land breathed a quiet, ancient life of its own. The rolling South Downs were not yet the green, quilted hills we know today, but raw, untamed ridges rising above thick forests and marshy valleys. The sea lapped further inland then, the coastline shifting with time, and where today Brighton and Chichester hum with traffic and trade, there was only the wind and the slow rhythm of early human footsteps. Those first footsteps date back tens of thousands of years. In the cliffs near Boxgrove, flint hand-axes and fossilized remains tell the story of early hominids, our long-distant cousins, who hunted and scavenged the floodplains of what was then a rich and fertile land. Boxgrove man, as he came to be known, left a shinbone and teeth behind, remnants of a hunter who lived around 500,000 years ago. That alone places Sussex among the oldest human landscapes in all of Britain. But it was not until the end of the last ice age that the land truly began to awaken. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, small bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers roamed the thick woods and river valleys, following herds and seasons. They left behind traces, middens of shellfish, shards of stone tools, and charcoal from fires long extinguished. They had no towns, no written words, but they knew the land, its rhythms, its dangers, its gifts. Then came the Neolithic farmers. A quiet revolution swept Sussex around 4000 BC as new peoples brought with them an entirely different way of life, settled agriculture. The forest was cut back to make room for grain. Pigs, sheep and cattle replaced the wild deer and boar. And on the slopes of the downs, something astonishing began. They dug. At Sisbury Ring, near what is now Worthing, Neolithic peoples carved deep into the chalk to extract flint, the precious raw material of the Stone Age. They gouged out shafts over 10 meters deep with antler picks and shoveled the chalk by hand. This was no small labor. It was industrial-scale mining by prehistoric standards, and it hints at a society more complex, more organized than we often imagine. Sisbury was a hub, a center of trade, and the flint from its mines traveled far, perhaps even across the Channel. But these people did not only work the land, they shaped it with meaning. Across the downs, from the heights of the Trundle, near Goodwood, to the mysterious Medway megaliths not far beyond the border, they raised monuments of stone and earth. Causewayed enclosures, burial mounds, and long barrows dotted the landscape. These were more than graves, they were places of memory, of ceremony, of connection between the living and the dead. In one such barrow, the remains of ancestors were carefully placed, bones arranged, offerings left. These burial rites speak of a people for whom death was not an end, but a transformation. The landscape itself became sacred, a map of memory etched into hill and valley. Time moved on, and with it, the people changed. The Bronze Age arrived around 2500 BC, bringing new tools, new customs, and perhaps new faces. The Beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery, spread across southern Britain. In Sussex, the land saw its first metal tools, its first weapons, forged not from stone but from bronze. Copper, alloyed with tin, mined far to the west. Barrows, round and solitary, rose again on the downs. Unlike the earlier long barrows, these were often single graves, perhaps the resting places of chieftains or warriors. From Ditchling Beacon to Chanctonbury Ring, these silent domes of earth still catch the light of the sun as it rises and falls, holding their secrets tight. Bronze meant power, it meant prestige, but it also meant violence. For the first time, the archaeological record shows not just tools of survival but weapons of war, axes, daggers and spearheads. Beautiful, functional, deadly. The bronze warriors of Sussex lived in a world increasingly defined by hierarchy and conflict. Hill forts like the Great Ring at Devil's Dyke began to appear, part settlement, part stronghold, built high to see the approach of friend or foe. And still, the land remembered. Fields were marked out with lines of flint and ditch, early signs of organized farming. Livestock grazed where once only wild beasts had roamed. The people of prehistoric Sussex were no longer wandering bands. They were villagers, miners, traders, warriors, the architects of a society inching toward civilization. By the time iron began to replace bronze, sometime around 800 BC, Sussex had already been shaped by thousands of years of human hands and dreams. The Iron Age would bring with it new tribes, the powerful Cantiaci and the Belgae, and new challenges including the growing threat of a power rising from across the sea. The Romans were coming, but before their legions ever set foot on this soil, Sussex had already lived a dozen lives. It had watched glaciers retreat and rivers form, had hosted mammoths and flint miners, barrow builders and bronze warriors. It was a land carved not only by wind and water, but by memory and myth. A land even then preparing to meet history head-on. And it is here, standing on the edge of a new era, that we step into the story of how the Roman Empire came to Sussex, and how Sussex, in turn, helped shape Roman Britain. Chapter 2. Roman Sussex. When the Romans came, they did not come quietly. In 43 AD, under the Emperor Claudius, the legions of Rome marched into Britain, a land of fog, forests, and fiercely independent tribes. Sussex, with its strategic position along the southern coast, soon became one of the first pieces of Britannia to fall under Roman control. The chalk hills that once echoed with the footfalls of Bronze Age tribes now felt the measured, unrelenting tread of soldiers trained to conquer and build. At the time of the invasion, the people of Sussex were part of the Atrebates, a powerful tribe whose territory stretched across the south. But politics on the island had already been complicated. Verica, a local king and ally of Rome, had fled across the Channel after being ousted by rival tribes. His plea for help gave Claudius the perfect excuse to invade. And so, with elephants in tow and war machines ready, the Roman Empire arrived. What followed was not just conquest, but transformation. The very structure of society began to change. The Atrebates fractured, and from their eastern lands emerged a new tribe, or rather a client kingdom, called the Regni. Ruled by Tiberius Claudius Cogidubnus, a local king loyal to Rome, the Regni became the Roman face of Sussex. Cogidubnus, possibly educated in Roman customs and fluent in Latin, was the ideal bridge between two worlds. Rome rewarded him with a title, Rex et Legatus Augusti in Britannia, king and imperial legate, a rare honor for a Briton. It was under Cogidubnus that one of the most astonishing sights in all of Roman Britain was born, Fishbourne Palace. Nestled just outside what would become Chichester, Fishbourne was no ordinary villa. It was a sprawling complex grander than anything else of its kind in the province. With its colonnaded courtyards, mosaic floors, underfloor heating, and ornamental gardens, it rivaled the villas of Gaul and Italy. Built around 75 AD and expanded in the decades that followed, Fishbourne was a statement, not only of wealth and taste, but of loyalty. This was Rome's way of saying, "We are here to stay." Inside its walls, life would have felt remarkably Mediterranean. Slaves and servants scurried through kitchens and corridors. Guests reclined on couches, sipping wine imported from the continent, discussing politics, poetry, or perhaps the latest dispatch from Londinium. In the courtyard gardens, sculpted hedges and imported plants created an oasis far removed from the cold mists of the downs. And beneath the mosaics, like the famous dolphin mosaic still visible today, lay heating systems powered by hypocausts, a marvel of Roman engineering. But Fishbourne was only the crown jewel in a wider transformation. Across Sussex, Roman villas began to dot the landscape. These weren't just rich men's homes, they were the hubs of agricultural estates, working farms that produced wheat, wool, and wine for local consumption and even for export. Places like Bignor and Angmering became centers of Romanized rural life, blending native traditions with Roman architecture, diet, and dress. Roads, too, cut across the countryside. The Romans were masters of infrastructure, and they wasted no time in lacing the province with their signature highways. Stane Street ran like a spine from Chichester, then called Noviomagus Reginorum, all the way to London. Straight, durable, and remarkably efficient, it allowed legions, merchants, and messages to move at a pace unknown to previous generations. Chichester itself began to grow as a Roman town. With its forum, bathhouses, temples, and grid-like streets, it was a model of Roman urban planning. Here, the native and the foreign mingled. Soldiers from the Danube rubbed shoulders with Celtic farmers, Roman bureaucrats dealt with local disputes, and Latin became the language of administration, even as the old tongues lingered in homes and markets. But beneath the surface of Roman order, the land remembered its past. Hill forts like Sisbury Ring were abandoned or repurposed, their tribal symbolism slowly eroded by the new regime. Old gods were reinterpreted, their names Latinized. Roman altars stood beside sacred springs, blending Jupiter with local deities, Venus with ancient fertility spirits. It was not a clean replacement, but a cultural fusion, often subtle, sometimes uneasy. Not all Sussex residents embraced Roman life. In the far reaches of the Weald, beyond the easy reach of Roman roads, the old ways persisted longer. There, in the dense forests and iron-rich soil, small communities continued to smelt metal using traditional techniques, pay homage to native gods, and live in roundhouses rather than stone villas. But even they could not remain untouched forever. Roman coins found buried in remote locations tell of trade or tribute, or perhaps simply curiosity. The empire had a long reach. By the 2nd century, Sussex was firmly Roman. The legions had moved further north, the frontiers pushed into Caledonia. Peace, or what passed for it under Rome, settled across the county. Villas flourished, towns grew, and for a time prosperity reigned. Yet, even as mosaics glimmered in candlelight and aqueducts whispered with flowing water, cracks began to show. The empire was vast, its borders strained, its centre uncertain. The 3rd and 4th centuries brought economic troubles, threats from Saxon raiders along the coasts, and a gradual decline in urban life. Fishbourne itself was partially destroyed by fire around 270 AD and never fully rebuilt. Perhaps it was an accident, perhaps it was something more. By the early 5th century, Roman authority in Britain was unravelling. Troops were recalled, taxes went uncollected, and the great machinery of empire ground to a halt. The roads still lay straight across the downs, but the legions were gone. Chichester fell silent. Villas were abandoned or taken over by squatters. The mosaic floors cracked under weeds and time, and yet, even in retreat, Rome left its mark. The very bones of Sussex had been reshaped. Fields still followed Roman layouts. Roads still carried travellers and merchants. The name Noviomagus faded, but Chichester remained. And the people who lived in this land, now neither Roman nor fully native, would carry fragments of both worlds. Out of this crumbling order, new forces would rise. From across the sea came new settlers, fierce, pagan warriors speaking strange tongues. They did not come to trade or serve, but to settle, to conquer, to claim. The Saxons were coming, and with them a new kingdom, one that would one day give Sussex its very name. Chapter 3. A Kingdom is Born. The legions had gone, the villas crumbled. The once bustling roads of Roman Sussex were overgrown with grass, silent but for the wind. A long twilight fell over the land, a time historians call the Dark Ages, not because the people vanished, but because their stories grew faint. Yet amid this darkness new voices rose, new warriors came. And from the wreckage of Rome a new kingdom emerged, fierce, pagan, and proud. Its name was the Kingdom of the South Saxons, South Saxons, Sussex. They came by sea. No longer was the coastline a line of defence, it had become a gateway. From the shores of what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark, Saxon warriors crossed the channel in longboats, following rumours of abandoned farms, defenceless towns, and a land ripe for the taking. It was not a single invasion, but a slow tide, a series of migrations that changed the very fabric of Britain. One name stands out among these newcomers: Ella. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ella arrived in 477 AD with his 3 sons and a fleet of ships. They landed at a place called Timensora, possibly near modern-day Selsey, and fought the Britons, driving them inland. For decades, Ella and his warriors carved out territory in blood, pushing back the remnants of Romano-British rule and stamping their mark on the land. By the close of the 5th century, the South Saxons had laid claim to the region we now call Sussex. But Ella was more than just a warlord. He became the first recorded king of the South Saxons, and his dynasty, though loosely defined, would leave a legacy that echoed long after his death. He is the first ruler described as Bretwalda in some sources, a high king, a kind of overlord among the other Saxon rulers. Whether this title reflected real power or myth-making, it suggests the early importance of Sussex in the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon Britain. Life under Ella was nothing like the Roman days. The great villas fell into ruin, towns emptied, trade shrank. The new South Saxons lived in wooden halls and small hamlets, spoke Old English, and worshipped strange gods, Woden, Thuna, and Frigg. Theirs was a warrior culture, bound by kinship, loyalty, and honour. Blood feuds were common, cattle were currency, the sword was law. Yet even in this harsh world, a new kind of order began to form. The South Saxons established royal estates and boundaries. They cleared forests, planted crops, and raised livestock. The Downs, once home to barrows and Roman farms, now echoed with the voices of Saxon herders and ploughmen. They renamed the rivers, the hills, the woods, replacing Latin with Saxon, memory with myth. But while the South Saxons had forged a new kingdom, they remained isolated. To the east were the Kentish, already in contact with the continent. To the west, the Gewisse, later known as the West Saxons, were growing in strength. Sussex, by contrast, clung to its paganism and its independence. For nearly 2 centuries, it stood apart, resisting both Christian conversion and political unification. That would change. In the 7th century, Christian missionaries began to pierce the pagan fog that clung to Sussex. First came failure. St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory in 597, made little headway here. Sussex remained hostile, its people stubborn in the old ways, but in time, persistence paid off. In 681, a new figure entered the story, Bishop Wilfrid. Wilfrid, a charismatic and controversial Northumbrian churchman, had been exiled from his homeland. Seeking refuge, he came to Sussex and changed its course forever. According to Bede, the venerable chronicler of English Christianity, Wilfrid found the South Saxons in dire straits. A drought had devastated their harvests. Many were starving. In an act both spiritual and practical, Wilfrid taught them to fish, not just for salvation, but for survival. But Wilfrid brought more than food, he brought baptism. With the support of King Ethelwald, Sussex was converted to Christianity. Churches were founded, monasteries built. At Selsey, Wilfrid established a bishopric, planting the seeds of a Christian institution that would flourish long after the kingdom itself had faded. The pagan gods receded into shadow. In their place rose the cross. Christianity brought Sussex closer to the rest of England. It connected the South Saxons to the Latin-speaking church, to the continental networks of Rome, and to the growing power of neighbouring kingdoms. But it also marked the beginning of the end for Sussex's independence. In the 8th century, the kingdom came under increasing pressure from Mercia to the north and Wessex to the west. Sussex kings, once proud and free, found themselves eclipsed by more powerful neighbours. Some were reduced to client rulers, others absorbed entirely. By the early 9th century, Sussex had been annexed by Wessex, folded into the growing English nation under the leadership of the West Saxon kings. And yet Sussex did not disappear. Its people, its customs, its place in the story of England remained. The Old Kingdom became a shire, a division within a larger whole, but its roots ran deep. The South Saxon name, South Sax, would endure in the very identity of the region. The memory of Ella, too, would survive, less as a man than as a symbol. A founder, a warrior, a king who carved a homeland from the chaos of post-Roman Britain. And behind him, the echo of 1,000 untold lives, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, monks, mothers, all building something new from the ashes of the old. Sussex had been born again, not as a Roman province or a forgotten frontier, but as a kingdom of its own, pagan, then Christian, isolated, then connected, fierce, then folded into something greater. The story of Sussex was far from over. Ahead lay invasion, rebellion, plague, prosperity, and more kings to come. But now it had a name, a people, a place in history, and history, as Sussex would learn again and again, never rests for long. Chapter 4. Norman Shadows. The South Saxon kingdom had found its place within the growing fabric of England. It had witnessed the rise of kings, the slow spread of Christianity, and the blending of old ways with new faiths. But nothing in Sussex's long history could prepare it for what came in the year 1066. For when the Normans crossed the Channel, they didn't just conquer, they transformed. And nowhere in England was that transformation more immediate, more brutal, or more enduring than in Sussex. It began on a ridge near the town of Hastings. In late September 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, landed on the Sussex coast at Pevensey with a fleet of ships and an ironclad claim to the English throne. He brought with him knights, archers, horses, priests, and a promise that he would take by sword what he believed was his by right. Only a few miles inland, King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, rushed south with his weary army, fresh from victory over the Norwegians in the north. The two forces met on the 14th of October. What followed was one of the most famous battles in British history, the Battle of Hastings. It raged for hours. The Saxons formed a shield wall along Senlac Hill, holding firm against wave after wave of Norman cavalry and archers. For a time, it seemed they might win. But William was cunning. He feigned retreats, lured Saxons from their ranks, and then crushed them with fresh charges. By dusk, the shield wall had shattered. Harold lay dead, possibly struck by an arrow to the eye, though history is unclear and perhaps a little theatrical in its remembering. What is certain is that his death ended Saxon rule, and Sussex, once the birthplace of the South Saxon kingdom, became the crucible of a new foreign power. William wasted no time asserting control. Even before he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, he turned his gaze back to the land that had first felt the weight of his conquest. Sussex was not just a prize, it was a warning to the rest of the kingdom. Here he would build castles, not merely to defend but to dominate. They rose like stone thunderbolts across the county. At Hastings, William ordered the construction of a motte and bailey castle on the very battlefield where Harold had fallen. It was not just a fortress, but a monument, a statement of divine favour and earthly power. Later, this wooden structure would be replaced with a grand stone abbey, Battle Abbey, whose altar was said to stand on the very spot where the English king had died. It was part penance, part propaganda. The Normans could be ruthless, but they knew the value of spectacle. Further west, Arundel Castle took shape on the high ground overlooking the river Arun. Its great stone keep, towering above the surrounding land, became a seat of authority and one of the oldest continually inhabited castles in England. The de Montgomery family, close allies of William, were granted the land and turned Arundel into both a military stronghold and a symbol of Norman aristocracy. Lewes, too, felt the heavy hand of conquest. William de Warenne, one of the conqueror's most loyal companions, was granted vast swathes of Sussex. He built Lewes Castle atop a natural rise, a motte and bailey that soon grew into a formidable stone fortress. Around it, the town of Lewes flourished, shaped by the rhythms of feudal power. The castle looked down on the priory of St. Pancras, another Norman foundation, and a reminder that control came not only through arms, but through the church. In all, Sussex became a land of lords and fortresses. The Normans divided the county into rapes, a curious term derived from the Old English rap, meaning a division or slice. Each rape had its own castle and its own lord, responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and raising troops. These divisions, Chichester, Arundel, Bramber, Lewes, Pevensey, and later Hastings, were unique to Sussex and reflected its role as the gateway to England. But castles and laws were not the only legacy of Norman rule. The very face of the land changed. Stone churches replaced wooden ones. Romanesque arches and carved capitals appeared in parish naves. The English language itself began to twist under the pressure of French. 1,000 new words filtered in: castle, court, lord, justice, each a subtle reminder of who now held power. The people of Sussex did not rise in rebellion, not immediately. The shock of Hastings, the brutality of the conquest, and the swift redistribution of land had left the native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy broken. Manors passed into Norman hands. Saxon thanes became serfs or fled or simply disappeared from the record. Yet resistance lived on in stories, in whispers, in the stubborn endurance of custom. And over time, as the decades passed, a new kind of England began to emerge. One neither fully Saxon nor fully Norman. Marriages were made, laws were adapted. The Normans who came as conquerors began to think of themselves as English. Their children spoke a new tongue, ate English bread, and prayed in churches built with French stone. But in Sussex, the memory of conquest never faded. The castles stood as daily reminders. At Bramber, the ruined keep looked down on the valley like a watchful eye. At Pevensey, the old Roman walls were fused with Norman towers, one conquest layered upon another. And at Battle, the abbey's stones told a quiet tale that a kingdom had died here and a new one had risen from its bones. Sussex, once ruled by the South Saxons, had become a frontier of Norman power. It was governed, divided, and reshaped according to the will of men who had come from across the sea. And yet the land endured. The downs still rolled toward the horizon. The sea still whispered against the shore. Beneath the shadow of the castles, life went on. But the peace of Norman rule would not last forever. New kings would come, new conflicts would rise, and the people of Sussex, though subdued, would not remain silent. Ahead lay rebellion, reformation, and the slow grinding birth of modern England. The Normans had carved their mark into stone. Now others would come to challenge it. Chapter 5. Monks, Markets and Medieval Life. The Norman conquest had redrawn the map of Sussex in stone and steel. But once the castles were built and the crowns were claimed, life settled into a different rhythm. Not one of kings and battles, but of bells and barley, of saints and sickness, of monks, markets, and the quiet daily grind of the Middle Ages. This was the world most people knew, and in Sussex it unfolded beneath spires and thatch, among winding lanes and wind-swept fields. At the heart of this medieval life stood the church. It was more than a place of worship. It was the anchor of every village, the keeper of time, the gate between heaven and earth. From the grandeur of Chichester Cathedral, with its soaring Norman architecture and gleaming spire, to the smallest parish chapels nestled in the folds of the Downs, the church marked out the calendar in holy days and harvests. Its bells summoned the faithful, tolled for the dead, and echoed across hills and hamlets like a voice from God himself. But Sussex's spiritual landscape was not only dotted with churches, it was home to great monasteries. Monks at Lewes Priory, one of the wealthiest in England, lived lives both austere and powerful. Behind their cloistered walls they prayed, copied manuscripts, brewed ale, tended sheep, and administered vast tracts of land. At Battle Abbey, founded by William the Conqueror, on the very site of his victory, the Benedictine monks maintained not only a spiritual order, but a political one, reminding the people of divine right and Norman dominance in equal measure. Pilgrims travelled these roads, seeking healing or forgiveness. Some came to the shrine of St. Richard of Chichester, a beloved 13th-century bishop whose relics were said to perform miracles. Others passed through on their way to Canterbury or Winchester, walking with aching feet and whispered prayers. Along the way they found shelter in hostels run by monks, and alehouses run by villagers who knew piety and profit went hand in hand, and if the church shaped the soul, the market shaped the stomach. Sussex in the medieval period was not just a land of prayer, it was a land of trade. In towns like Lewes, Arundel, Steyning, and especially Rye and Winchelsea, markets bustled with life. Rye, perched on the edge of the marshes, was a member of the Cinque Ports, a powerful confederation of coastal towns that supplied ships to the king in exchange for privileges. Its cobbled streets and timber-framed houses became a hub of maritime commerce, linking Sussex with France, Flanders, and the wider world. Further along the coast, Winchelsea, originally built on a now lost site swallowed by the sea, was refounded in the 13th century as a model town, laid out in a neat grid with wide streets and strong defences. It traded in wine, wool, and salt, and became a jewel of the south coast before centuries of erosion and conflict wore it down. In its heyday, though, it was a gateway between England and the continent, a place where merchants rubbed shoulders with monks and French sailors drank beside English pilgrims. Inland, life was slower but no less vital. Villages were arranged around open fields where strips of land were worked by peasants, freemen, villeins, and serfs alike. A man's status was written in his obligations. Some owed labour to the local lord, others paid rent in coin, chickens, or sheaves of wheat. The manor was the centre of rural life, a self-contained world where the Lord's Hall cast its shadow over the church, the mill, and the muddy tracks of a people tied to the land. The rhythm of the seasons dictated everything. Spring meant planting, summer brought haymaking, autumn was for harvest, and winter was a time of mending, spinning, and storytelling by the hearth. Ale was brewed thick and strong, bread was dark and coarse, and meat was a rare luxury, unless you had the king's leave to hunt. Most meals were a pottage of whatever was available: beans, barley, turnips, herbs, simmered slowly over smoky fires. Clothing was simple: woolen tunics, leather boots, linen coifs. Children were put to work early. Women tended gardens, baked bread, spun wool, and raised the next generation of labourers. Life was harsh, but it was understood, a cycle as old as memory, broken only by birth, marriage, or death. And sometimes death came in waves. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Sussex like a storm. It arrived by ship, perhaps through Rye or Shoreham, carried by fleas on rats. No one understood the cause, but everyone knew the terror. Whole villages were emptied, fields went untended, corpses were buried in mass graves, and priests recited last rites until they, too, fell silent. Some churches were abandoned, some families vanished entirely. It's said that 1 in 3 people in England died, in some places even more. The plague reshaped society. Labourers became scarce, and those who survived could demand higher wages. Some lords offered freedom in exchange for work. The old order trembled. A peasant who once bowed low now bargained. In Sussex, as elsewhere, this quiet shift began to undermine the strict hierarchies that had ruled for centuries. Yet even in the face of death, life pushed on. Festivals returned, markets reopened, monasteries rebuilt. In the villages, people danced the maypole again, celebrated saints' days with pageants and ale, and told tales of devils, miracles, and ghosts. The church remained central, but doubts were creeping in. Stories of corrupt abbots, greedy bishops, and indulgences bought and sold planted the first seeds of discontent that would one day bloom into reformation. But that lay ahead, for now Sussex, in the later Middle Ages, was a land both humble and rich, not in gold, but in tradition, in ritual, in the quiet heroism of everyday life. The shadow of the castle still loomed, but within that shadow people found space to live, to love, to worship, and to work. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Chichester, monks still chanted. In the back rooms of Rye's inns, sailors still gambled. And in the fields beyond Lewes, under skies unchanged for 1,000 years, the people of Sussex carried on. Their names are mostly lost, their stories seldom told. But they were the heart of the county, the ones who sowed and reaped, who who prayed and mourned, who built the world we live in. And as the bells tolled the end of the medieval age, the winds of change began to stir. A new world was rising, shaped by kings and reformation, by exploration and war. Sussex would again find itself in the path of transformation. But for a moment it paused, a land of abbeys and ale, of plague and pilgrimage, of markets and memory. Chapter 6. Sussex in Tudor Times. The Middle Ages in Sussex had closed beneath the toll of church bells and the shuffle of muddy boots in market squares, but the dawn of the Tudor era brought a fire that would not be so easily extinguished. What began as political intrigue in the halls of London soon scorched the counties of England, and Sussex, with its proud monasteries, its coastal inlets, and its stubbornly devout people, found itself at the turbulent crossroads of rebellion and reform. At the heart of it all stood the Church once again, but not as a source of unity. This time, the Church itself would break apart. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with the Pope and Rome. What followed was the Reformation, a religious earthquake that shook the country's foundations, cracked its ancient abbeys, and tore through every corner of daily life. In Sussex, where monasteries like Lewes Priory and Battle Abbey had stood for centuries, the change was swift and merciless. By the late 1530s, the great monasteries were dissolved, their lands were seized by the Crown, their treasures carted off, their libraries scattered or burned. Lewes Priory, once a towering symbol of Norman devotion, was systematically dismantled. Stones from its walls were taken to build new houses. Its monks, once cloaked in black, were turned out onto the roads. Battle Abbey, too, was gutted, its sanctified silence replaced with the clang of demolition and the scrape of royal accounts. To some, this was liberation. To others, it was sacrilege. Sussex, long a land of pilgrimage and quiet faith, found itself divided. In 1536, news of rebellion in the north, the Pilgrimage of Grace, sparked murmurs in the south. In the Weald and along the downs, peasants and priests alike wondered how far the king's reach would go. Some whispered of joining the cause, but Sussex, perhaps too close to London, too carefully watched, did not rise. It simmered. Then, under Mary Tudor, the flame burned in a different direction. Queen Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, sought to reverse the Protestant tide and restore England to Catholicism. Her tools were not persuasion and prayer, but fire. Nowhere in Sussex was that fire more visible than in Lewes. In 1557, 10 Protestant men and women were tied to stakes in the town and burned alive for heresy. Their names were ordinary, Richard Woodman, Thomas Harland, Anne Tree, but their fate was unforgettable. The flames that consumed them lit a new kind of devotion, not to Rome, but to the right to believe freely. Every November since, the people of Lewes have remembered. What began as a solemn commemoration became, over centuries, the raucous spectacle of Lewes Bonfire Night, part protest, part theatre, part echo of martyrdom. Religion, once the glue of village life, had become a weapon. And yet, amid the sermons and smoke, Sussex was also changing in quieter, more enduring ways. Along the coast, ships were growing larger. Harbours, once fit only for fishing boats, now welcomed merchant vessels with canvas sails and foreign goods. Rye and Winchelsea, though bruised by French raids and coastal erosion, adapted. Shoreham and Seaford stirred to life. Chichester turned its face to the sea. Trade brought opportunity but also tension. Smuggling, long a shadowy tradition in Sussex, flourished in these years. Tariffs and restrictions made honest trade difficult, and the winding inlets, hidden coves and chalk cliffs offered perfect cover for those who preferred their profits unrecorded. Barrels of French wine, bolts of Flemish cloth and chests of Spanish silver were slipped ashore under cover of night. Whole communities, from farmer to magistrate, turned a blind eye. In some cases they actively helped. Smuggling was not just a crime, it was a way of life. Inland, the dissolution of the monasteries had reshaped the landscape. Monastic lands were granted or sold to nobles and merchants loyal to the crown. A new class of landowners emerged, ambitious, Protestant, and eager to show their wealth. Tudor manor houses rose amid the old Saxon fields. Gardens were laid out in geometrical patterns. Chimneys sprouted where once there were only open hearths. The yeoman farmer, independent and prosperous, became the backbone of the countryside, but not all prospered. The enclosure movement, slowly accelerating during the Tudor era, began to bite. Common lands, once used by villagers to graze animals or gather firewood, were fenced off, claimed by the wealthy for sheep grazing and wool production. Those without title or tenancy were driven off the land, swelling the ranks of the poor. Some drifted to towns in search of work. Others turned to begging, or worse. Vagrancy laws grew harsher, and gallows were raised not just for murderers, but for the desperate. Sussex, once largely self-sufficient, was drawn more deeply into the web of national politics. The rise of literacy and the printing press brought news and propaganda into even modest homes. Ballads, sermons, and scandal sheets spread faster than ever. The old boundaries between crown, church, and county blurred, and still the great drama of the Tudors played out. After Mary came Elizabeth, who walked the tightrope between tolerance and orthodoxy with a calculating grace. Under her reign, the religious fires cooled, and peace, of a sort, returned. Sussex became a place of quiet Protestantism, of watchful loyalty, but always just beneath the surface, the memory of martyrs and monks lingered. By the end of the 16th century, Sussex was no longer the place it had been. Its cathedrals still stood, but the abbeys were ruins. Its people still prayed, but not all to the same God. Its markets bustled, but now with goods from across the globe. And its shores, once the site of conquest, had become a new frontier, for trade, for smuggling, for ambition. The county had been tested by fire, both real and metaphorical. It had survived reform and rebellion, queens and inquisitors. And as the Tudors gave way to a new dynasty, Sussex stood once more at the edge of change. New powers would rise, new wars would come, and the people of Sussex, shaped by centuries of conquest and conviction, would once again find themselves caught between crown and conscience. Chapter 7. Sussex in the English Civil War. The Tudors were gone, their great drama concluded, but the stage of England remained crowded with conflict. When the crown passed to the Stuarts, hope flickered that peace might finally settle over the land. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered between king and parliament, church and conscience, tradition and change, and in time those tensions would ignite. In 1642, civil war broke out across the kingdom. It was a war not of distant armies and foreign fields, but of neighbours, churches, and family names. Sussex, though spared the great bloody battles of the north and west, would be no refuge. It became a county divided, torn by loyalties, scarred by skirmishes, and forever changed by the war between Cavaliers and Roundheads. At first glance, Sussex might have seemed far from the heart of the conflict. There were no sieges of great cities here, no rolling battlefields like Naseby or Marston Moor. But its geography, stretching from the Channel coast to the edges of the Weald, placed it in the path of ambition and anxiety. Royalist strongholds and parliamentarian towns sat uneasily beside one another, their loyalties often as tangled as the hedgerows that marked their borders. Lewes, with its proud Puritan tradition and strong mercantile presence, leaned toward Parliament. Its citizens were cautious, politically aware, and wary of royal overreach. Chichester, on the other hand, was a city of cathedral and crown, its bishop loyal to King Charles. When war came, it sided with the Royalists, and soon paid the price. In December 1642, just months after the outbreak of war, a parliamentarian force under Colonel William Waller marched into Sussex. His target was Chichester. The city, though fortified by its medieval walls, was poorly defended. A brief siege followed, cannon fire echoed through the streets, and the Royalist garrison quickly crumbled. Within days, Chichester fell. Parliamentarian troops ransacked the cathedral. stabling their horses in the nave and smashing stained glass. It was not just an assault on a city, it was a statement. The old order was breaking and no sanctuary was sacred. Other towns watched and took note. Arundel, with its imposing castle high above the River Arun, became a site of strategic interest. Royalist troops occupied it in late 1643, seeking to control the surrounding countryside, but again Waller returned. In January 1644, after a determined siege, he forced the castle's surrender. The parliamentarians held it for the rest of the war, though the damage it suffered would leave scars for generations. Away from the towns, Sussex's rural communities endured their own quiet war. Loyalties were complex. In the Weald, long a region of independent yeomen and religious dissenters, parliamentarian support ran deep. Congregationalist chapels, secret prayer meetings, and Puritan preachers found fertile ground among those who viewed the king's bishops as little better than Catholic tyrants. In the Downs, where landowners had long-standing ties to the crown, royalist sympathies lingered, but fear of plunder, reprisal, and shifting tides often forced pragmatism over passion. The war was not a single storm, it was a series of squalls. Skirmishes flared and faded across the county. Columns of soldiers passed through, requisitioning food, horses, and shelter. Press gangs scoured villages for conscripts. Militia bands, sometimes no more than armed farmers, defended their homes from one another. There were stories of barns burned, livestock stolen, sons taken, and never returned. The war seeped into daily life, not in grand explosions, but in steady, wearing uncertainty. Smugglers, already adept at navigating Sussex's hidden inlets and wooded trails, found opportunity in the chaos. Arms and information passed through the shadows. Allegiances were bought, sold, and betrayed. The same route used to bring in barrels of French wine in peacetime now carried letters for the king or powder for Parliament's muskets. The lines between patriot and profiteer blurred. Religious fervour added another layer to the conflict. Sussex had long been a patchwork of belief. The fire that had burned Protestant martyrs in Lewes now smouldered in Puritan chapels. Royalist priests preached divine right and obedience to the throne. Parliamentarian ministers thundered of corruption and Antichrist. Churches split, communities splintered, and in many homes families were divided, brothers on different sides, fathers and sons unable to speak across the gulf of ideology. As the war dragged on, Sussex, like the rest of England, grew weary. The initial zeal faded, replaced by grief and fatigue. Fields went untilled, trade slowed, prices soared, plague returned, adding to the toll. And yet somehow life continued. Markets reopened, bells rang again, sometimes for victory, sometimes for mourning. When Charles I was captured, tried, and executed in 1649, the shock rippled through Sussex like a sudden frost. A king beheaded by his own people, such a thing was unthinkable, yet it had happened. The monarchy was abolished, England became a republic, and for a brief, tense period it was ruled not by kings but by generals. Oliver Cromwell's protectorate brought peace, but not unity. In Sussex, as elsewhere, the scars remained. Some welcomed the stability, others yearned for the return of the crown. Churches were stripped of ornament. The Book of Common Prayer was outlawed. Music and celebration were frowned upon. But behind closed doors, candles were still lit, songs still sung, toasts still made, to old ways and old kings. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and Charles II returned to England, Sussex breathed out, though not without caution. The war had changed things, allegiances had shifted, institutions been shaken, the power of Parliament had been proven, the absolute authority of the king had been broken, even if the crown was worn once more. Sussex had survived, not untouched, but unbowed. No great battlefield bore its name, but its towns had been sieged, its churches desecrated, its people tested. It had stood at the crossroads of rebellion and loyalty, and emerged changed. Beneath the surface of its green hills and quiet lanes lay the memory of cannon fire and prayer, of stolen sons and shattered stained glass. The war had passed, but the questions it raised remained. What was the true source of power? Where did loyalty lie? And could a nation, once divided so deeply, ever truly be whole again? In the years to come, Sussex would enter a new age of elegance, empire, and rising ambition. But for now, it paused. The smoke of civil war still lingered in the air, and the people, from castle to cottage, looked to the horizon, wondering what kind of England they had inherited. Chapter 8. Georgian Elegance and Smugglers' Coves. The fires of civil war had cooled, the crown was restored, and Sussex exhaled into a new age. Gone were the battered churches and urgent sermons of Cromwell's rule. In their place, rose-powdered wigs, Palladian houses, and the sound of violins drifting from drawing-rooms lit by candlelight. This was the Georgian era, an age of refinement and rebellion in equal measure. And in Sussex, two very different worlds unfolded side by side. One was draped in silk and bathed in elegance. The other lived in shadows, beneath the cliffs and behind cellar doors. It was Brighton, once a sleepy fishing village called Brighthelmston, that most clearly embodied the change. For centuries, the town had been little more than a weather-beaten scattering of huts facing the restless channel. Its fishermen hauled in herring and mackerel, their wives mended nets, and the narrow lanes smelled of salt, tar, and the sea. But erosion was relentless. The sea devoured parts of the town. The fishermen struggled. By the early 18th century, Brighthelmston seemed on the brink of fading into obscurity. And then fashion intervened. In the mid-17th century, sea bathing became the latest obsession of the English elite. Physicians claimed the salt water cured everything from gout to melancholy. The air, too, sharp and bracing, was thought to invigorate the blood. Coastal towns saw opportunity. Brighton, though battered, had one advantage: proximity. It was close enough to London to tempt the curious, but far enough to feel like an escape. Dr. Richard Russell of Lewes championed Brighton's waters in his writings, urging Londoners to take the plunge. His influence brought the first wave of visitors. Small lodging houses multiplied. Bathing machines, wooden carts rolled into the surf, offered privacy and propriety. Men and women, once cautious of the sea, now ventured in on doctors' orders. But Brighton's real transformation came galloping in with a royal entourage. In the 1780s, George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, began visiting Brighton. He came first for his health, then for pleasure. The seaside offered him an escape from court life, from scrutiny, and from the expectations of a crown he was not yet ready to wear. Brighton welcomed him with open arms and polished boots. What followed was a renaissance. The prince built the Marine Pavilion, which would later evolve into the dazzling Royal Pavilion, an architectural fantasy of domes and minarets, its exotic silhouette rising like a mirage against the Sussex sky. He hosted lavish dinners, scandalous parties, and summer retreats for his most fashionable friends. With him came artists, musicians, architects, courtiers, and gossip columnists. Brighton was no longer a village, it had become a playground for the elite. The town grew rapidly, elegant terraces sprang up, Regency Square, Brunswick, Kemp Town, the air filled with the sound of carriage wheels and the clink of champagne glasses. Grand hotels overlooked the sea. The railway, arriving in 1841, sealed Brighton's fate as the premier seaside destination of southern England. For the growing middle class of the Georgian and early Victorian era, a visit to Brighton became not just a luxury, but a statement. Yet behind the promenades and parasols, another Sussex thrived in secret. While Brighton sparkled in royal approval, the coastline to the east and west remained a theatre for something darker: smuggling. Long before it became a footnote in folklore, smuggling was a full-blown industry in Sussex. And during the Georgian era, it reached its golden age. Heavy taxes on goods such as tea, brandy, silk, and tobacco made smuggling almost inevitable. The English government, hungry for revenue to fund wars and empire, levied import duties so high that entire villages could profit more from a night of smuggling than a year of honest toil. In Sussex, with its winding paths, chalk cliffs, hidden coves, and tight-knit coastal communities, smuggling didn't just flourish, it became a way of life. Moonlit landings were common along the beaches of Seaford, Cuckmere and Rottingdean. Rowboats came ashore silently, their crews unloading casks of French brandy and bolts of fine cloth into waiting hands. Tunnels were dug beneath cottages, church crypts became storehouses. Whole inns, such as the Mermaid Inn in Rye, were rumoured to be connected by secret passages, their cellars echoing with whispered deals and the clink of contraband. The Hawkhurst gang, one of the most notorious smuggling syndicates in southern England, used Sussex as part of their network. They were not romantic rogues, but violent men, armed with pistols and not shy about using them. Customs officers often found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outwitted. In many cases, local authorities were complicit, or at least conveniently blind. Even parish priests occasionally turned up with suspiciously fine wine. Yet public sympathy often rested with the smugglers. To many, they were heroes resisting unjust laws, offering cheaper goods to the common folk, and defying the greedy hand of Westminster. In a time when the poor paid dearly for basic comforts, a little brandy and tobacco, no matter the source, was a welcome comfort. But the government fought back. The creation of the revenue cutter service and the deployment of dragoons across Sussex signalled a new seriousness. Clashes turned bloody, carts of contraband were seized, smugglers were hanged or transported. Gradually, as the 19th century advanced and tariffs fell, the golden age of Sussex smuggling came to an end. What had once been a hidden economy faded into legend. And so the Georgian age left its twin legacies on Sussex soil. On the surface it brought refinement, royal palaces, promenades, and the birth of the seaside holiday. Brighton became a symbol of pleasure and prestige, its royal connection cementing its place in the national imagination. Inland, Georgian manor houses and neoclassical churches whispered of order and elegance. Yet just beneath the surface lay a different Sussex, a Sussex of secret cellars, daring midnight voyages and silent figures on the dunes. It was a county that knew how to perform grace while hiding danger in its pockets. As the century turned and Victorian morality crept in, Sussex would again transform. The railway would bring more than tourists. Industry, reform and empire were coming, but the memory of moonlit coves and royal carriages would remain, etched into the chalk, folded into the cliffs and told in hushed stories wherever Sussex met the sea. Chapter 9. Victorian Industry and the Coming of the Railway. The smugglers faded into folklore, and the elegance of the Regency years gave way to something firmer, more practical, more purposeful. The 19th century had dawned, and with it came steam, smoke, soot, and transformation. For Sussex, a county of chalky hills and quiet farms, the Industrial Revolution arrived not with the roar of furnaces or the towering mills of the north, but with a humbler kind of power. It crept in through iron and rail, reshaped towns and habits, and carried a new generation to the sea in search of health, work, and leisure. Sussex was changing, not loudly but forever. Industry in Sussex had always existed in its own quiet way. Long before the great chimneys of Manchester and Birmingham darkened the skies, the wooded interior of Sussex, the High Weald, had been alive with fire and hammer. The Wealden iron industry dated back to Roman times, and for centuries it thrived on the region's rich deposits of iron ore and its seemingly endless forests, which fed the furnaces with charcoal. Water-powered hammers clanged in places like Buxted, Heathfield, and Lamberhurst. Cannons forged in Sussex had armed the Tudor navy and stood aboard the ships that defeated the Spanish Armada. But as the Industrial Revolution took hold, the Wealden ironworks found themselves outpaced. Charcoal was no match for coal, and Sussex had no coalfields. The great smelting towns moved north, closer to the mines and rail hubs of the Midlands and beyond. One by one, the old Sussex forges fell silent. By the middle of the 19th century, only their names and ruins remained, silent reminders of an age when fire ruled the forest. Yet, as iron faded from the Weald, another kind of metal began stitching Sussex together: rails. The railway arrived in Sussex like a spark to dry grass. In 1841, the London and Brighton Railway opened its line, linking the capital with the rising seaside resort of Brighton. What had once been an arduous, bone-shaking journey of 8 hours or more could now be done in just over an hour. With it came a revolution, not only in transport but in thinking. The train democratized travel. No longer the preserve of the rich in their carriages or the coach-bound middle classes, even the working poor could now afford a day at the sea. Seaside air, once the luxury of kings and courtiers, became a tonic for clerks, factory workers, and shop assistants. Brighton's streets filled with new faces, families in Sunday best, young couples on holiday, the curious, the hopeful, the tired. They came for the sea, the piers, the pleasure gardens, and the promise of escape. But Brighton was only the beginning. Branch lines soon spread like vines across the county. Hastings, Eastbourne, Worthing, Bognor Regis, all were drawn into the orbit of steam. Each town had its moment, its railway station, its new hotels and tea rooms, its promenade where parasols bobbed in the salt air. In Littlehampton and Seaford, sleepy fishing communities grew into holiday havens. Even inland towns like Horsham, Lewes and Haywards Heath found themselves humming with fresh activity. The Victorians built not just railways but confidence. Engineering marvels such as the Euse Valley Viaduct, with its majestic arches stretching across the Sussex countryside, symbolized a new kind of ambition. They were not merely routes of convenience, they were statements of power, order, and optimism. The county's geography, once a natural barrier, was now conquered. Hills were tunnelled, marshes were bridged, distance was overcome. With new connections came new industries. Brickworks expanded to meet the needs of a building boom. Market gardening flourished, supplying London with fruit, vegetables, and flowers. The fertile coastal plain became a garden of glass houses and orchards, sending produce north on the morning trains. In places like Worthing, tomatoes and early lettuces became a source of pride and profit. Tourism, too, evolved into an industry of its own. Boarding houses sprang up by the dozens, their windows facing the sea. Piers became cathedrals of leisure, stretching into the waves with their theatres, arcades, and bandstands. Eastbourne, carefully planned and dignified, became known as the Empress of watering places. Bognor Regis, once mocked as a muddy village, gained royal patronage. Even Hastings, battle-scarred and rugged, embraced its role as a resort, blending medieval charm with modern spectacle. Beneath all this, the Victorian order held firm. Sussex was governed by the rhythms of Queen and Empire, church and chapel, steam and schedule. The new towns had libraries, lecture halls and gas lamps. Education expanded, philanthropy flourished, workhouses loomed. The poor law shaped lives as firmly as any railway timetable. Yet not all was comfortable. The industrial age brought pressure as well as progress. Slums grew in Brighton and Hastings, where the promise of work outpaced its reality. Seasonal tourism bred seasonal employment. The labourers of the land now competed with mechanisation and imports, and though the railway offered escape, it also brought exposure. London's problems did not stay in London. Crime, poverty and vice rode the same trains as the tourists. Still, Sussex adapted. Victorian churches rose across the county, built in the Gothic Revival style, their spires reaching upward like aspirations carved in stone. Schools were founded, societies flourished, and the people, whether born in barn, boarding house or bank, lived by the code of progress. Steady, respectable, hopeful. The late 19th century brought electricity to the towns, telegraphs to the farms and bicycles to the lanes. Sussex was no longer a county apart, it was part of a network, a nation, an empire. Children in Chichester read of faraway wars in Africa. Tea in Tunbridge Wells came via India. The world was smaller now, even if the fields still rolled and the downs still rose against the sky. By the end of the Victorian age, Sussex had been quietly transformed. It had not been built on coal or steel, but on rail, resort, and reinvention. A county once known for monks, smugglers, and Saxon kings now advertised salt air, boarding schools, and mineral spas. But change, once started, rarely stops. A new century loomed ahead, one of motors and machines, war and wonder. The Edwardians would inherit a Sussex connected and confident, but not unshaken. For though the trains still ran on time, the ground beneath them would soon tremble. Chapter 10. Sussex in the World Wars. The trains still ran, the piers still glittered, and the laughter of holiday-makers still echoed down Brighton's promenade. But by the early years of the 20th century, something had shifted in the air. Beneath the confidence of a modern Sussex, wired, connected and fashionable, there pulsed an unease, the knowledge that change was coming again. Not gentle change, not steam or structure, but the grinding gears of war. And when it came, Sussex would not stand aside. It would find itself on the very edge of Britain's defence, a front line without trenches, a home front marked by blackouts, bombs and quiet acts of bravery. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Sussex responded with a mix of patriotism and grim resolve. Young men enlisted in their thousands, labourers from the Downs, shopkeepers from Lewes, students from Brighton College. The Royal Sussex Regiment, with roots deep in the county's soil, became a symbol of sacrifice. At the Battle of the Boar's Head in 1916, near Richebourg in France, the regiment lost hundreds of men in a single morning. The date, 30 June, became known as the day Sussex died. But the war was not only fought abroad, it came home in ways no one had known before. Sussex, with its wide skies and coastal position, became a staging ground. Troops trained on the South Downs, camps sprung up near Eastbourne and Shoreham. The flat beaches were ideal for practicing landings. The sky above was no longer just for birds. For the first time in history, war took to the air. German Zeppelins drifted across the Channel like ghostly predators, their engines low, their bombs indiscriminate. In 1915, one dropped its deadly cargo on the outskirts of Eastbourne, leaving craters and fear in its wake. Life changed. Gaslights dimmed, curtains were drawn tight. Women stepped into roles once closed to them, working in munitions, driving ambulances, managing farms. Children were sent inland, away from the coast, away from danger. Food shortages led to rationing. People queued for bread and soap. Letters from the front arrived with trembling hands. Some brought news, some brought silence. When the armistice was declared in 1918, Sussex, like the rest of Britain, staggered. The cost had been immense. Village memorials were carved with long lists of names, each etched in stone but still raw in memory. The county mourned and remembered, but life pressed on. The 1920s brought a kind of restlessness. The 1930s brought uncertainty. And then, only 2 decades after the war that was meant to end all wars, it began again. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Once more, Sussex prepared, but this time the threat was closer. This time the county stood directly in the path of invasion. The Sussex coast stretched just miles from Nazi-occupied France. In Hitler's plans, it was the doorstep to Britain, a vulnerable stretch of beaches and chalk. The county became a fortress. Pillboxes were poured from concrete and hidden in hedgerows. Barbed wire threaded its way across shingle. Anti-tank blocks lined the cliffs. Villages rehearsed their own destruction, ready to blow up bridges, fell trees, block roads. If the Germans came, Sussex would burn itself before it bent. Airfields sprang to life. RAF Tangmere, West Hampnet, Ford, and others turned fields into battle lines. Pilots flew from Sussex to defend the skies over Britain in the long summer of 1940. The Battle of Britain was not confined to London. The air war raged across the south. The sound of Spitfires and Hurricanes roared above Arundel and Bognor, over Worthing and Shoreham. Some aircraft returned with holes in their wings. Others did not return at all. The war reached into every life. Children were evacuated from cities to the Sussex countryside, shocked, hungry, wide-eyed. They arrived at train stations clutching gas masks and name tags taken in by families who had never met them. Towns that once welcomed tourists now absorbed strangers fleeing the Blitz. Brighton Pier was closed and partially dismantled so that it couldn't be used as a landing stage for invaders. Beach huts stood empty. The fun had gone, replaced by sirens and sandbags. Bombs fell here too. Eastbourne was shelled by German ships. Hastings suffered repeated air raids. Even the quiet inland villages were not always spared. Doodlebugs, the V-1 flying bombs, buzzed overhead in the later stages of the war, cutting their engines before crashing into homes and schools. The people of Sussex learned to listen for silence, the dreadful hush before impact. Still, life continued. People queued, planted vegetables, salvaged scrap metal. The Women's Land Army worked the fields, the Home Guard drilled in church halls, and underground, in secret, the county played its part in deception. At West Dean and Bletchingley, dummy tanks and fake airfields misled German reconnaissance. Operation Fortitude, the great campaign of misinformation leading up to D-Day, relied in part on the illusion of a massive invasion force assembling in Sussex, ready to storm Calais. Inflatable tanks, actors in uniform staged radio traffic. It was theatre with life-or-death stakes. And then, in June 1944, Sussex became the platform for liberation. From its fields, Allied troops embarked for Normandy. From its ports, landing craft crossed the Channel. Soldiers who had trained beneath the Downs now crossed into history. Many would never return, but those who did came home to a county forever changed. When the war ended in 1945, Sussex bore the marks. Craters pocked the earth. Bombed buildings stood like broken teeth. But there was pride too. The county had stood firm, its skies defended, its fields shared, its beaches guarded. Memorials rose again, names added to those from a generation before. But unlike in 1918, the victory in 1945 came with celebration. Street parties were thrown, bunting fluttered, the children danced in the ruins. Yet the war left more than rubble. It left a new world. The welfare state was born, towns rebuilt, tourism returned, but with new faces, Londoners drawn back, not just for sea air, but for rest, for healing. Brighton welcomed artists, thinkers, the bohemian and the battered. Austerity lingered, but hope stretched further. Sussex had been war's doorstep, but it had also been its shield. And in the process, it had become something else, resilient, diverse, modern. The peace that followed would not be perfect, but it would be earned. Chapter 11. The Age of Change. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of war still lingered in the Sussex air. Bomb craters dotted the coastline, windows were still boarded, and rationing stretched into the late 1940s. Yet beneath the weariness, something stirred. The war had not only destroyed, it had cleared ground. And in the silence that followed, Sussex, like the rest of Britain, began to imagine what might be built in its place. What rose from the rubble was not simply a reconstruction of the old, but the birth of something new. A different kind of county, shaped by vision, necessity, and hope. The changes came quietly at first. Bricks replaced bombs, councils drew up plans, roads were resurfaced. But soon the transformation accelerated. In 1947, Parliament passed the New Towns Act, and Sussex found itself at the centre of an urban experiment. Crawley, once a small market town with a population of just a few thousand, was chosen to become a new town, one of several across the country designed to relieve the pressure on bombed-out London and to build modern communities from scratch. Crawley became a blueprint for post-war planning, self-contained neighbourhoods, open green spaces, schools within walking distance, and carefully separated residential and industrial zones. New houses sprang up in Ifield, Pound Hill and Broadfield. Shopping parades, civic centres and business parks followed. Families from across Britain, and increasingly from the Commonwealth, were drawn to Crawley's promise of work, housing and modernity. It became not just a town, but a symbol of Britain's new social contract, of optimism and of reinvention. Other towns grew too. Worthing and Hastings expanded their housing estates. Eastbourne modernised its seafront. Brighton, long the jewel of the Sussex coast, saw its faded Victorian grandeur slowly infused with something bohemian, artistic and unconventional. In the narrow streets of the lanes, antique shops, cafes and record stores began to replace crumbling boarding houses. Students, writers and performers arrived, drawn to Brighton's sea-salted charm and its quiet resistance to conformity. That resistance found fertile ground in another post-war creation, the University of Sussex. Founded in 1961, nestled in the rolling folds of the South Downs near Falmer, the university was a statement of intent. Unlike the ancient colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, Sussex was modern, interdisciplinary, and defiantly forward-thinking. It became a beacon of progressive thought during the cultural upheaval of the 1960s and 70s, attracting radical thinkers, experimental artists, and ambitious scientists. Here, in lecture halls framed by glass and steel, students debated nuclear disarmament, civil rights, and post-colonial politics. The campus buzzed with new ideas. The university didn't just educate, it challenged. It offered a new identity for Sussex, one rooted not in castles or cathedrals, but in curiosity and change. Yet even as Sussex embraced the future, it began to look inward to protect what was ancient and irreplaceable. The South Downs, long walked by farmers and poets alike, had always been vulnerable. Post-war development threatened to carve them into housing plots and motorways. But resistance grew. Campaigners, environmentalists, and everyday walkers called for protection. They argued that the Downs were not simply scenery, they were soul. The battle was slow, but it was won. In 2010, the South Downs were officially designated a national park. Stretching from Winchester to Eastbourne, they now stood safeguarded, a green spine across the south of England. Sussex, once defined by conquest and commerce, now added conservation to its identity. Walkers, cyclists, and naturalists flocked to the hills, the chalk paths, the tumbling valleys, the skylarks overhead. They were no longer taken for granted, they were treasured. But perhaps the most profound change to post-war Sussex was less visible and more human. After the war, Britain opened its doors to the Commonwealth. Sussex, like many counties, became home to new communities, Caribbean families who arrived on the Windrush, Indian and Pakistani immigrants seeking opportunity, and later refugees from war-torn corners of the world. They brought with them new languages, new religions, new foods, and new traditions. And in doing so, they wove new threads into the fabric of Sussex life. Mosques and temples appeared alongside medieval churches. Festivals like Diwali and Eid joined the county's calendar. In Crawley, Hastings and Brighton, corner shops, takeaways and restaurants offered dishes once unknown to the English palate. Children of immigrants attended local schools, grew up with Sussex accents, and called the county home. Of course, change was not always smooth. There were tensions, moments of resistance and misunderstanding. But over time, the idea of what it meant to be from Sussex began to stretch. It now included more faces, more histories, more voices. The county was no longer simply a landscape of flint cottages and cricket greens. It was a mosaic. Technology added another layer to the transformation. The rise of the internet, the decline of the high street, the shift from manufacturing to services all left their mark. Young people left in search of work, then returned to raise families. Commuter towns grew as trains to London became faster and more frequent. The boundary between city and countryside blurred, and yet, for all the change, much remained. The sea still rolled against the shingles, the downs still caught the morning light, the pubs still served Sussex ale, villages still held fetes and flower shows. It was this blend of old and new that defined the county, a place where a medieval church might sit next to a modern art gallery, where a South Asian wedding procession might pass beneath a thatched archway. By the end of the 20th century, Sussex had been reshaped not by empire or invasion, but by ideas, planning, education, migration, preservation. It had become, in many ways, a microcosm of Britain itself, deeply rooted, endlessly evolving. And still the story wasn't finished. A new millennium waited. Climate change, globalization, housing pressures, digital life, all loomed on the horizon. But Sussex had seen much. It had been forged in conquest, tempered by war, softened by leisure and sharpened by change. It had learned how to hold history in one hand and possibility in the other. The past still walked its lanes, but so did the future. Chapter 12. Modern Sussex. Sussex today stands between past and future, between sea and sky, between memory and momentum. It is no longer the county of a single story. Instead, it is a landscape of contrasts, a patchwork of ancient roots and modern ambitions stitched together by winding lanes, commuter lines, and the long, steady breath of the English Channel. It is a place where Norman castles cast their shadows over solar panels, where Saxon church towers share the skyline with wind turbines, and where the echoes of iron forges are drowned out by the hum of servers in glass-fronted tech hubs. Sussex is still Sussex, but it has become something else too, a mirror of 21st century England. Travel through the county today and you'll pass through centuries in the space of a single afternoon. One moment you're walking the cobbled streets of Rye, where half-timbered houses lean into narrow lanes as if huddling against time. The next, you're in Brighton's North Lane, surrounded by graffiti murals, vegan cafes, and co-working spaces filled with creatives and coders. Just down the road from the ancient ruins of Lewes Priory, you'll find craft breweries, pop-up galleries, and climate activists organising the next protest. Brighton, long the county's heartbeat, has become a city of unapologetic individuality. Once the playground of Regency princes and seaside holidaymakers, it is now an epicentre of culture, inclusivity, and political energy. Each year, Brighton Pride transforms the streets into a celebration of diversity. Tens of thousands march, dance, and sing in a dazzling display of colour and freedom. It is one of the UK's largest Pride events, a festival that speaks not just to LGBTQ+ rights, but to the soul of the city, defiant, welcoming, and alive. And yet, step just a few miles inland, and the scene softens. In the villages of the Weald, life moves to a different rhythm. Church bells still ring out across fields where sheep graze as they have for generations. Cricket is played on village greens surrounded by flint walls and rose-covered cottages. The roads narrow, the hedgerows thicken, and Sussex shows its age in all the best ways. But even these quiet places are not untouched by the times. The pressures of the housing market ripple through the countryside. Second homes and rising prices strain rural communities. Young people leave for cities, retirees arrive from them. Old pubs close, then reopen as gastropubs. Farmhouses are restored with underfloor heating and satellite broadband. The tension between preservation and progress is everywhere, but so is the quiet determination to adapt. The county's economy too has changed shape. Where once Sussex thrived on wool, iron, and tourism, it now looks to technology, services, and sustainable innovation. In places like Gatwick Diamond and the Sussex Innovation Centre, startups and science parks buzz with activity. Clean energy firms test new turbines near the coast. Agricultural researchers study climate-resistant crops. Universities collaborate with global companies. The South East may no longer be the factory of the empire, but it is a laboratory for the future. Green thinking has become a defining part of the Sussex identity. The South Downs National Park, finally designated in 2010 after decades of campaigning, has become a symbol not just of beauty, but of resistance against unchecked development. Walking trails crisscross ancient chalk hills, shepherds still tend their flocks, and conservation projects strive to protect rare butterflies, orchids, and birds. In New Haven, offshore wind turbines rise like sentinels on the horizon. Solar panels glint from rooftops. Climate marches pass through towns once better known for markets and Morris dancing. History remains close, of course. Sussex doesn't forget. The keep at Arundel still looms over the Arun Valley. Battle Abbey still stands where Harold fell. Heritage railways puff through the countryside on weekends, their carriages filled with families, volunteers in uniform, and the steam-sweet scent of nostalgia. Museums preserve flint tools, Roman coins, and Victorian prams. But the past here is not a museum, it's a companion. Something carried, not confined. Education and ideas continue to thrive. The University of Sussex and the University of Brighton draw students from across the globe. They bring questions, energy, and complexity to a county often imagined as sleepy or static. Their graduates fill local companies, charities, schools, and startups. They change the tone of conversation, from the climate crisis to artificial intelligence, from mental health to digital art. And Sussex listens. It is not always quick to change, but it does change. The same soil that once absorbed the boots of Roman soldiers now holds the cables of fibre-optic broadband. The same wind that once filled the sails of Norman invaders now turns turbines that power smart homes. In Eastbourne, retirees walk the promenade beside teenagers on e-scooters. In Chichester, cathedral choirs practice alongside community climate groups. In Crawley, mosques and gurdwaras stand beside old parish churches. Diversity has become more than a feature, it is a fact. The descendants of immigrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa and Eastern Europe live, work and raise families here. Sussex is no longer monocultural. It is layered. It holds different languages, religions and customs within a single shared landscape. Its identity is not lost. It is layered, evolving, broader than before. But even as Sussex looks outward and moves forward, challenges remain. Rising housing costs stretch families thin. Coastal erosion threatens low-lying towns. Public transport struggles to meet demand. The digital divide cuts between rural and urban areas. And in a world of global shocks, pandemics, political instability, and environmental pressure, Sussex is not immune. Still, it endures. That has always been its strength. Sussex changes, but it doesn't vanish. It absorbs, adapts, and continues. Its cliffs may crumble, its railways may be delayed, its skyline may shift, but its soul holds. So what does Sussex mean in the 21st century? It means standing on the edge of the downs, wind in your hair, watching a red kite circle overhead. It means browsing vinyl in Brighton, or buying apples from a roadside honesty box in Petworth. It means pride parades and harvest festivals, Wi-Fi and weathered stone, bicycles and bell towers, biotech and blackberries. It means looking back without getting stuck and forward without forgetting. It means being a place that is never quite finished and never quite the same. And as we close the final chapter of this journey from flint mines to fibre optics, we do so knowing that Sussex is still writing its story between sea and sky, always between.